My story started 40 years ago in a little town in Iowa called Sioux City. And what I know about my biological mother is that she fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. My birth mother was 19 years old. She was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father. And sadly, one of the greatest statistics she fits is one that isn't often talked about in our society, and that's coercion. You know, it's so interesting, isn't it, that we live in this society that talks about abortion being a choice and a right. But when you peel back those words, when you listen to women's experiences, what we often find is that so few women have so little choice. And the Elliott Institute puts out some great statistics. If you haven't checked it out, I would encourage you to. But the Elliott Institute indicates that over 64% of women, 64%, identify feeling pressured into their abortion. Just one of the reasons why all of our efforts are so important. And I spent years of my life believing that my birth mother must have been one of those women coerced into her abortion with me, just based on the little bit I knew about her growing up. You know, unfortunately, what I've actually learned in recent years is that it was taken even one step further for her in her life. She wasn't just coerced into the saline infusion abortion that was meant to end my life and forever changed hers. It was literally forced upon her against her will. She had no choice. And of course, if you understand the dynamics of abortion, you can probably start to guess in your head who it would have been that would have forced that abortion upon her. The first guess is usually that it was my biological father. That would make the most sense, because we know that men play a very important role when it comes to life being protected and respected, or ultimately rejected in our society, no matter what the abortion industry tries to tell men, right? We've heard for 44 years that it's not anything men should be concerned about, but we know abortion affects men too. And by and large, men are also a part of that abortion decision. But it wasn't my biological father that forced that abortion upon her. It was my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. And if you understand abortion, if you're out on the sidewalk, if you're talking to women, of course, through counseling services, you know that this dynamic is played out time and time again in our society still today. Very well-intentioned friends, family members, sometimes medical professionals, sometimes even members of the clergy will influence an abortion decision to be made, either by coercion or by force. You know, in my grandmother's case, I know she had to know an awful lot about the scientific and biblical basis for when life begins. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in their community. She oversaw the education of multitudes of young nurses. And so I know she knew about the scientific basis for when life begins. But she also knew an awful lot about how to make a secret, forced abortion take place on her own daughter, with the help of a friend and colleague, the local abortionist. Some of you may remember the saline infusion abortion from back in the 1970s. It was the most common procedure back then. And for those of you that aren't aware, you can, of course, look it up on the internet or read about it in medical journals. If you read about it, you'll read about how that saline infusion abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald me to death. When you look it up online, you'll read about how children like me are actually called the red-skinned or candy-appled babies, because that toxic salt solution would turn the skin bright red as it peeled it away and moved internally into the organs. You would also read about how that procedure usually lasted about 72 hours. The child's life was effectively ended by that toxic salt solution. And then premature labor was induced with the intent of that deceased child being delivered. What we actually know through my medical records is that I didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for just 3 days or 72 hours. My records actually indicate that I soaked in it for 5 days, I soaked in that toxic salt solution, slowly being poisoned to death. And no matter what people believe about abortion in our society, most people tend to agree with me that what happened to me over those 5 days was horrific. But I always encourage people in our society to also recognize that what happened to my birth mother over those 5 days and every day thereafter was also horrific. That is why we do the work that we do, because every child deserves better than abortion, and every woman deserves better than what my biological mother has experienced in her life. Over that 5-day period, they tried time and time again to induce my birth mother's labor with me. You know, I often joke now, you can probably guess I'm a little stubborn. And I just wasn't going anywhere quickly. But all kidding aside, the longer I soaked in that toxic salt solution, the greater the likelihood should have been that my life was successfully ended. And when I was delivered at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa on that 5th day, I was delivered believing that I would be a successful abortion, otherwise known as a deceased child. And as hard as it is to hear those things, I hope you take joy alongside me when we recognize God clearly had other plans that day 40 years ago. Absolutely. You know, I wish I could stand here tonight and tell you that when I was delivered alive that day, everyone there rejoiced. But you know, this isn't how this is supposed to happen. And if you haven't heard of it before, I'll tell you a little bit about how our society views lives like mine. We're actually called the dreaded complication of abortion, a child who lives. But we know that this is not a complication. This is a blessing. This is a gift. It is a miracle. And that day when I was born alive, certainly a lot of panic went through that hospital room. You know, as you're going to hear tonight, it's taken me most of my 40 years to piece together the events of those days. But one of the first things that I was told early on in this process is that when I was born alive that day, the abortionist looked upon my live birth and demanded that I be left in that room to die. You know, I told the detective earlier, if Gosnell would have been my birth mother's abortionist, I would not be alive today. If I would have been delivered somewhere else other than that very hospital, I truly believe that my life would have been ended, because that demand was very clear. Children like me were placed in a utility closet in that hospital after they survived abortion attempts, placed in buckets of formaldehyde where they would be picked up later as medical waste. I will never know if I made it to that utility closet. But what I do know is that demand was made about my life. You know, it's an incredibly sad reality when we recognize that I'm not the first child in our country that has happened to. And it's, of course, a sad reality when we recognize I'm also not the last child in our great country that has happened to. But for me, the saddest reality comes in now knowing who really made those demands about my life that day. I now know that it wasn't the abortionist who demanded that I be left to die. Maybe you've already figured out who it was. It was my grandmother. Once again, not only did she force the abortion upon my biological mother, but she was there when I was born alive that day. And even though this wasn't supposed to happen, here I was, her firstborn grandchild, and she is the one who demanded that I be left there to die. And I know that's hard to hear. But this is what abortion has done to our society. We have now ended the lives of 59 million children in our country. People are making life and death decisions about lives like mine every single day. Mine just happened to be my grandmother. And so I don't falter for that. And no matter what decision she made about my life, I don't hate her. I love her. I love her in that unconditional, radical way that Jesus loves each and every one of us, that way that we're called to love other people in return, and I think most people struggle with some days. That's how I feel about her. And I am so thankful that no matter what decisions she was making about my life, there were nurses on staff at that hospital who defied her orders. We heard about 2 nurses over the years who were on staff that day. But earlier this year, I actually got to speak to a nurse on the phone who was there at the hospital that day when I was delivered alive. She wasn't there in the room when I was delivered, but she was there in the neonatal intensive care unit when I was rushed in. She was able to share with me how that day the door to the NICU came flying open. She said, Melissa, that was pretty normal stuff, right? Babies were born under distress. The door to the NICU would come flying open. But she said what came out of that nurse's mouth that day was anything but normal. And I'll clean up the language a little bit. Remember, it was a stressful time for them. The nurse rushed me into the NICU and she shouted, "That darn Dr. Kellberg messed up." Dr. Kellberg was, of course, the abortionist. But she went on that day and she said, she just kept gasping for breath. She just kept gasping for breath, and so I couldn't just leave her there to die. And so she didn't. Just an ordinary person like you and me, who by the grace of God was called to do something extraordinary that day. You may never see this side of heaven, the fruits of your labor, but I guarantee to each and every one of you, you are making a difference every day by your actions, your words, your prayers. I owe my life to that nurse. I owe my life to that nurse, because you would never know by looking at me tonight, right? That I should have been poisoned and scalded to death in the womb. You would never know by looking at me that when I was whisked to the NICU that day, the prognosis for my life was very poor. When I was delivered alive that day, I weighed a little less than 3 pounds. I was a whopping 2 pounds, 14 ounces, which actually indicated to the medical professionals that my birth mother was much further along in her pregnancy than that 18 to 22 weeks that the abortionist had indicated in my medical records. And one of the first notations by a neonatologist after I was born alive is that I looked like I was probably about 31 weeks gestational age when I was delivered. 31 weeks. And I'm so thankful that the Lord hid the truth about my life, because I truly believe that the longer I stayed in the womb, the longer, the greater the likelihood would be that I could ultimately survive. And so here I was, about 31 weeks gestational age. Like many premature infants, I suffered from severe respiratory and liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. The doctors actually thought I had a fatal heart defect initially because of the way my body presented itself to them. But it didn't take them long to realize that there was nothing structurally wrong with my heart. It was simply the amount of distress that I was under. But they were very guarded about what my future would hold. They indicated if I continued to live for very long past my infancy, I would suffer from multiple disabilities throughout my life, which leaves some of you staring intently at me right now, right? Just one of the burning questions you all have, right? Is there something wrong with her that we can't see? As you can probably guess, I get that question a lot. And as you can probably also guess, no matter what the doctor said my life was going to look like, I am perfectly healthy today. Thanks be to God once again. And I know God was very deliberate in my life, as he is in all of our lives. You know, God gave me the gift of health and a strong voice and a pretty healthy dose of courage so that I could put this face to the world and say, this is what 59 million other children would have looked like in some way, shape, or form, if only they had been given the opportunity. And I am so thankful that no matter what the doctor said about what my life was going to hold, my parents, my adoptive parents, as other people know them, I simply know them as mom and dad, no matter what they were told about what my life was going to hold, they didn't hesitate for a second to open their hearts and their home to me. And you'll catch my parents sometimes in interviews talk about how that first time they met me, I was still lying in an incubator full of tubes and wires, fighting for my life. And my parents often share that that moment they laid eyes on me that day, they fell in love with me. And I want that for every child in our world, don't you? Every child deserves the opportunity to have someone fall in love with them. Every parent, whether it's biological or adoptive, deserves the opportunity to fall in love with their child. And how many times has abortion robbed children and parents of that great opportunity? We know how often that has happened. And we are all working together to write a different story, a love story for those children and their parents. And mine truly has been a love story. My parents' love radically transformed my life. I was healed and healthy enough to go home to them less than 3 months after surviving that failed abortion. That is the power of love. And that's also how we know we are going to win this culture of life being restored, because we combat the evils of this world with love. And love does change things. And I was raised in a home to know that I was deeply loved, and not just by my adoptive parents and not just by God, but my parents raised me to know that I was deeply loved by my biological parents. I think that is one of the most important things my parents ever could have done in my older sister, who's also adopted. I really think that's one of the most important things they could have ever done with our lives, because we were raised to know that adoption was a blessing, that our parents made a courageous, selfless decision, and they loved us enough to give us life and the amazing gift of our family when they couldn't care for us. What I didn't know, of course, was the story behind my adoption. My parents kept it a secret from me, afraid of how that knowledge would change my life, afraid of how that knowledge would impact how I felt about my biological parents. But God intended for me to know the story of my survival, and He allowed it to come forward in a very unplanned, unexpected kind of way when I was 14. My older sister, as a high school student, faced her own unplanned pregnancy. And I think many of us in the pro-life movement know these moments, right? I lovingly call them the when the rubber hits the road moments, because we can be raised in homes with very firm beliefs about life and adoption. And then when the rubber hits the road, the question is, what path is someone going to take? Like many women in that position, my sister had a lot of fears, and she was actually contemplating all of her options, which included abortion. But she was brave enough to tell our parents about that pregnancy, knowing that she could always trust in them to support her. But I don't take that for granted in today's world, and I'm sure that you don't either. Most people, if you talk to them, will say that they don't have a supportive friend or family member to turn to in their time of need. That's why the work of the Pro-Life Union is so important, why all of our efforts are so important, to let people know that there is always someone they can turn to. And it made all the difference in my sister's life to know that she could turn to our parents. When she told them that she was facing that unplanned pregnancy and was contemplating all of her options, our parents felt like they were called to tell her something very important, the story of my survival, hoping that she would understand the depths of that decision she was considering. It was over 26 years ago now that my sister was told the story of my survival. I'm happy to tell you my oldest nephew is about 25. He's a member of the military. He's a single father. He's one of the most amazing people I have ever known in my life. And he most importantly knows that he was not a mistake, as no one ever is. He was made for just such a time as that. I truly believe that, because there was probably no other way I would find out the story of my survival except through his very life. Because after my sister found out the story of my survival, like any good teenage sister, there's some sisters here tonight, like any good teenage sister, she didn't keep it a secret from me. You know, my parents learned a pretty big lesson that night, just how quickly two sisters can pass along a story, right? She got to me far faster than they ever could have imagined, and she didn't tell me everything, but she did encourage me to ask our parents for more to the story of my life. And people often ask me in hindsight, well, you know, Melissa, didn't you ever see this news coming? Didn't you ever feel different? And I'm sure you know the answers to those two questions, right? No, I never felt this different growing up. And no, back then I didn't know that abortions could fail and children could live. And even if I would have known those things, I never would have thought for a second that I was one of them. And so then to hear my mother speak the words that night Missy, your biological mother, had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it. The words were absolutely shocking, and every bit as devastating as they were afraid it was going to be. Whether you're 14 or 41, I will guarantee you those words will change your life forever. I knew in that moment of time God alone spared my life. I knew God had a very clear purpose and a plan for me. But I think sometimes it's hard to embrace our purpose when we're in the midst of great pain. And I was in pain that night. I was in pain for many nights after that. I had to work through the anger and resentment I felt for the first time towards my biological parents for that decision that was made to end my life. I had to work through the shame and embarrassment I felt for being a survivor in a world that doesn't have a lot of positive things to say about people like me. I had to overcome the guilt that I felt for surviving when I knew tens of millions of children were not as fortunate. And even though I stumbled initially in that journey of pain throughout my teenage years, I know God alone spared me from myself once again. And God placed it on my heart years ago that he was calling me forward to share his story with the world. When I went away to college, I knew that it was time to start moving forward with what God was calling me to do. But before I came forward, I wanted to accomplish a couple tasks. I wanted to obtain my medical records. That makes sense to most people, right? If you actually look up stories about me that you can read on the internet, some of them are pretty fascinating. And one of the most common arguments you'll find about me in our secular society is that I look too normal for what happened to me. We can all laugh nervously together about it. Trust me, it doesn't bother me anymore. You know, my most common reply to that is, my apologies, it wasn't my plan, right? It was God's plan. I get to go along for the ride. But when people say those things, they are admitting that they know what abortion should have done to me. So the medical records make sense to most people. What people don't always understand is why I went looking for my biological parents. But that's quite simple. I love them too. And I wanted them to know that I'm not angry or bitter about the decision that was made to end my life. I wanted them to know that I've led this incredibly blessed life. And it took me over 10 years to find them. It took me over 10 years to obtain my medical records. You know, during those 10 years of searching, I learned an awful lot about how abortion affects all of our lives. But I also learned an awful lot about God's will versus the plans that we have for our lives. You know, after 10 years of searching, I had to continue to trust in his will versus the plans that I had set out for myself. I had to trust in his perfect timing versus that timetable that I had set up in my head. And of course, after 10 years of searching and finally the great surrender, in 2007, I obtained my medical records after being told time and time again throughout the years, no, there is no such thing. You can actually see copies of my medical records in my book that was released earlier this year, or in various videos that you can see of me on the internet when I've testified before Congress a couple times, or of other efforts I've been involved in. In those records, they say things like, a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? In a world that doesn't often want to talk about what abortion is, my medical records are pretty clear about what abortion is and what it does. I'm only alive today because it didn't succeed in ending my life. And as hard as it was to read through some of those medical records, I ultimately experienced great joy. Because when they sent them to me, they committed a very big mistake. In one little tiny corner, they forgot to black out my birth parents' names. We would call that a HIPAA violation in today's world, right? Not me. I call that divine intervention. I don't know about you. Because trust me, in 10 years of searching and doing things my way, that hadn't happened. And so the Lord blessed me, I know, with those medical records and the names of my biological parents in one fell swoop. And because God is the God of restoration and reconciliation, he wasn't done there. That night, I started searching on the internet for my biological parents, and you're never going to guess what I discovered. I was living in the very same city as my biological father. I had moved to Sioux City, Iowa during my 10 years of searching, simply to finish my master's degree. That's what my head was telling me, right? What I never could have fathomed is that it was all part of God's greater plan. And so 30 years after the abortion had taken place there, my biological father was still there. And I prayed about it for many months before I ultimately contacted him. I ended up sending him a letter to his office and not his home over 10 years ago, letting him know, of course, that I was alive and well and that we were in the very same city. If he ever wanted to communicate or have a relationship, I would be waiting to hear from him. And it's been over 10 years, and I'm still waiting. And that is okay. Think about how I learned to trust in God's will during my years of searching. You know, during that time, I also started searching for my birth mother. I actually couldn't find her through my searching, but I found her parents. You know that grandmother that I told you all about at the beginning? I didn't know back then the role that she played in the abortion taking place, and I simply reached out to them, asking for them to pass along messages to my birth mother. Very graciously, my grandfather replied within days. In his letter, he admitted that I knew my live birth was not the intention that day at the hospital. And he went on and told me some things about my biological family. But he closed his letter by letting me know that my messages would not be passed along to my birth mother, because in reality, they were completely estranged. And it makes sense, doesn't it? When we know the dynamics of that forced abortion, it makes great sense that their relationship has been forever changed. And I know that even though our circumstances are very unique, we are not alone in this either. Entire families have been forever impacted by abortion. Abortion doesn't just end one life. It impacts multiple lives. It changes relationships and families for generations unless there is healing that occurs. But that was the last time I heard from my grandparents, was over 10 years ago. And that's when I stepped forward publicly for the first time. I think you guys have a picture you were going to queue up for me tonight. You know, the first time I spoke publicly was on Capitol Hill, because that's a really friendly place for somebody like me, isn't it? And of course, under those circumstances, I was out there saying, "Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity. I'm never going to do this again." Right? I told my husband as I went home, "Oh, I'm not a public speaker." But I am. I'm a bundle of nerves, right? I was so sick to my stomach. What we very quickly determined, though, is that it wasn't a bad case of nerves. It was a horrible case of morning sickness with that child you see on the screen. God is good, isn't he? That is our oldest daughter, Olivia, who is now 9. We also have a 3-year-old Ava at home. And it was during my pregnancy with Olivia that I got involved in pro-life ministry. You can flip that back, thank you. During my pregnancy with her, I started to travel the world in defense of life. What I didn't know is that at the same time, my birth father was back home fighting for his. That's why he never replied to my letter, because he passed away about 6 months after I sent it to him. And I only learned that because I very innocently Googled his name on the internet from time to time, hoping to find out some things about his life, right? To have some sort of connection. But of course, that time, it wasn't his life that I read about. It was his passing. And as I questioned God in the midst of my suffering that night, God spoke very plainly back to me. He said, "Be patient, Melissa, because my plan is much greater than the one you had in mind." And it's always true. It may not look anything like we expect it to, but God's plan is always greater. And as the months unfolded, I got to see God's plan. God's plan involved Olivia being born at St. Luke's Hospital. You heard me correctly. The very same hospital where my life was supposed to end. And not long after Olivia was born at that hospital, the man that you saw on the screen came into my life. If you can remember his face, it's my grandfather, my biological father's father. Even though my birth father never connected with me, when he passed away, his family went to clean out his office, and they found my letter. And in the midst of their incredible grief over his loss, my grandfather and my great aunt entered into our lives. And you can see the look of joy on his face, can't you? And even though my grandfather and my great aunt are the only family members that have entered into our lives, I take hope, because I know my birth father's family is still in the midst of their own healing. All of this is very new to them. And so I take hope, knowing God's not done working in their lives yet, just like he's not done working in yours, and he's not done working in mine. But as I close tonight, I want to share with you my greatest source of hope. And that comes from seeing what has happened in my birth mother's family. Even though I haven't heard from my grandparents for many years, one of her cousins contacted me about 5 years ago. That's how I found out that the abortion was forced and my grandmother was responsible for so many things. That cousin connected me quickly with my 2 half-sisters and also with none other than my biological mother. As you can probably imagine, those were difficult conversations for my birth mother and I to have, even by email. But there was one big reason why it was so difficult. There was one final secret about my life that even my adoptive parents didn't know. And that is that my birth mother spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. She did not know. She was told it is a monster. It is hideous. Don't look. The child is dead. And she lived 30 years of her life with immense regret. Everything we know about how abortion impacts someone physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, my birth mother experienced that. And so she questioned how I could love her. She questioned how she could ever be forgiven. And we spent about 3 years building trust with one another before we met face to face for the first time over 1.5 years ago. And what I will tell you is that she is one of the greatest supports in my life. She is a huge part of my family. And on the days that are difficult for me, because those days still do exist, she is the one who has urged me on and said, Melissa, I need you to keep doing this. You are the very first person who ever fought for me. And so I will continue to fight for her and the women like her who deserve true resources and support in our world. I will fight for the children like me who deserve the opportunity to live. I will fight for the future generations to come like my 2 daughters. I will fight for the grandparents and the aunts and uncles, the siblings, the extended family members, our communities who deserve better than what abortion has done to all of us. And I know I'm not alone in this. And I thank you tonight for all you have done and all you will continue to do here in Philadelphia and around our country and world to make a difference.